Buju, wago shindigu migizi indodem, gazaga squaji mekag, indun jaba. One of the most common questions that many people like to ask Native Americans is one of terminology. Is it Indian, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation person, or what? And there's nothing like not knowing how to frame a question to completely paralyze a conversation. I'll share my perspective, although I should preface my remarks by saying that my perspective is just a perspective. And there are many other Indigenous people who have very different views on the topic. I would love, personally, for us to do what they did in Canada. In Canada, they have representatives from all of the Indigenous communities in a grand council, and they had an ongoing and lengthy public discussion and debate about preferred terminology, and they agreed to settle it as follows. Instead of calling the communities reserves, which had been the custom in Canada for quite some time, they changed the word to First Nations. And people from those communities, instead of Indian or Aboriginal, which had been used for a long time in Canada, they switched to just saying First Nations people. There are actually 3 formal labels in Canada: First Nations. The other is actually for the Arctic Indigenous community, which said that they prefer the term Inuit. And then the third label is Métis, and that is for a distinct group of people who actually have Indigenous as well as French and Scottish ancestry, who had distinct communities and language. In fact, the language is called Michif, and during the Louis Riel rebellions in the late 1800s, were fighting for independence. Today, all 3 of those are active terms in Canada, each for distinct groups of people: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Here in the United States, I would love for us to do something like that, say Native Nations or something like that. Not too many syllables, not hard to pronounce, everybody knows who you're speaking about and speaks to our sovereignty and indigeneity. But we are not quite there. The terms Indigenous, Native, and Native American are what we would call politically correct. You will probably not offend somebody, hurt their feelings. They're pretty safe, but they are kind of ambiguous. So if we say Indigenous person, someone is indigenous to every continent in the world except for Antarctica. So you end up having to clarify by saying North American Indigenous or something like that. And it still gets to be a lot of syllables, so it can be clunky. Certainly we, do have affinity with, for example, the Maori in New Zealand and other Indigenous peoples around the world. But that collective entity is distinct from the political identity of, being Indigenous here in the United States, like an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe. And so, because of this, we're still searching for even better terms. The same really happens with Native or Native American. You just have to establish a context, because if I say a Chicago native, does that mean a Native American person from Chicago? That's a lot of syllables. Or just somebody born and bred, so to speak. Now, the term Indian or American Indian obviously came from Christopher Columbus when he was lost and thought he found China. No, Japan. No, India. Yes, and these are Indians. Boom. And the label stuck. So it was clearly a misnomer. And because of that, some Indigenous people here in America say, don't call me that. However, the term has not been put to rest, because being Indigenous American actually is not just a distinct racial category, but a distinct political identity. And in fact, in American legal statutes and laws, they use the term American Indian, and that's a way to distinguish this political class from the rest of the indigenous population of the world who might happen to now call America home. And both because of this, and because there were big organizations like the American Indian Movement and the National Congress of American Indians, which have really held on to these labels, those words are still around and they still are preferred by some people as a way to speak to this political group. Now, for myself, you may notice with my talking and writing that I have used, I think, all of these at some point in time, mainly as a means of establishing safe space so we can talk to the issues and have open conversation and not have everybody walking around on eggshells. But at the same time, I do think that terminology matters. And I would love for us to move in the direction of some agreement around the vocabulary, but we are not there yet. And by the way, we are not alone in not getting there yet. The Black community has had many debates about, terminology. Black or African American usually preferred, things like colored people are out, but maybe people of color as a label that's more inclusive, still being employed. We still have these debates going on in the Latinx community with strong preferences around any number of the options there too. And so I'll just say that, while we search for some common ground about a better set of labels, the other thing that I would recommend is simply this. If you happen to work for a school or a community organization, then I would recommend having this conversation with your Native stakeholders and saying, hey, what are your preferences for labels? And when you vet it with your Native parent committee, for example, then it'll do a couple of things. One is it empowers them to be part of the decision-making process that generates their engagement with your organization. They'll be bringing their own informed opinions, which will be good ones. And you can adopt their guidance. And then if anyone else ever gives you a hard time about what you're doing, you can say, thank you very much for your input. We take labels seriously here, and we regularly have this conversation with our Native stakeholders. We're following their guidance now, but when we revisit the conversation again, I'll be happy to make sure that your comments make it into that consideration. And what that gives you is a get out of getting beat up around the ears card, and we could all use one of those. Miigwech? Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, resources for the Ojibwe language, teachers, and more. Miigwech.